The Bible gives her 13 verses. 13 verses to describe one of the most remarkable journeys in the ancient world. It tells us she was wealthy beyond measure. She came with camels bearing spices and gold in great quantity and precious stones. It tells us she was wise enough to test the wisest man alive. It tells us what she brought and what she asked and what she received, a complete exchange between two of the greatest figures in antiquity. What it does not tell you, and not once, not in any of those 13 verses, is where she was from. No country, no name, no ethnic description, not a single geographic marker. For 2,000 years, the Western world has assumed it knew the answer. Africa never forgot it. And tonight I am going to show you exactly what that difference means. I want to begin with the text itself. 1 Kings, chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. Not a summary, not a paraphrase. I want to read it the way a detective reads an evidence file, noting everything it says, and noting just as carefully everything it does not. The Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, concerning the name of the Lord, and she came to test him with hard questions. Stop there. She heard of his fame. That tells us the knowledge of Solomon had traveled far enough to reach her. Whatever the distance between Jerusalem and her kingdom, news of this king had crossed it. She came to test him with hard questions. The Hebrew word translated as hard questions is hiddot, riddles, a Semitic intellectual tradition, the formal exchange of riddling questions between learned individuals practiced across the ancient Near East. This matters. We will come back to it. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. 3 commodities: spices, gold, precious stones. Now I want you to hold those 3 commodities in your mind. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart, and Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba had observed all of Solomon's wisdom, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his valets, and his burnt offerings that he made at the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. No more breath in her. That is one of the most vivid expressions of overwhelm in the entire biblical text. She said to the king, "The report was true that I heard in my own land of your accomplishments and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. Not even half had been told me. Your wisdom and prosperity far surpassed the report that I heard." Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba every desire that she expressed, as well as what he gave her out of Solomon's royal bounty. Then she returned to her own land, she and her servants. That is the entire account. 13 verses. Now look at what the text does not contain. No name. She is never named. No country of origin. She is never located geographically. No ethnic description. We are told nothing about how she looked, how she was dressed in a way that marked her origin, what language she spoke. The text describes the most intimate intellectual exchange of the ancient world. A queen who tested the wisest king and found even her highest expectations exceeded, and provides 0 geographic information about where she came from. The Bible does not say Arabia. The Bible does not say Africa. The Bible says Sheba, and that single word, that one word, has been carrying 2,000 years of contested history. I grew up in Nasuka. My grandmother kept a small parlor in her house, a room of photographs and framed prints and things she considered important enough to hang on a wall. On that parlor wall, when I was about 9 years old, I noticed a framed print I had never really looked at closely before. A portrait. A dark-skinned woman in elaborate robes, gold and amber tones, surrounding her with the suggestion of a queen's gravity. I asked my grandmother who the woman was. She said, without looking up from what she was doing, "The Queen of Sheba." She was ours. I was 9 years old and already beginning to think like a scholar's child. My father's skepticism had been working on me. I said, "But Grandma, how do you know she was African?" She set down what she was doing and looked at me with the patience of someone who does not need a library to know what is true. She said, "Because we remember." I did not know what to say to that. I was 9. and my father had told me that memory without documentation was not the same as knowledge, so I stored the portrait and her words somewhere in the back of my mind and moved on. Decades later, at Soos, I learned to navigate the scholarly consensus: Arabian, Sabaean, Yemeni. The Queen of Sheba, the dominant academic tradition maintained, came from the kingdom of Saba, modern Yemen across the Red Sea on the Arabian Peninsula. I accepted it. The evidence seemed to require it. I did not think again about my grandmother's parlor portrait for 20 years. Then something happened. 3 things, actually, in rapid succession, and I would like to tell you what they were. The first thing was reading the Kebra Nagast in full, not excerpts, not a scholar's summary. The full text. The Kebra Nagast, which means in Ge'ez the glory of kings, is an Ethiopian sacred epic. It was compiled in its present form between 1314 and 1322 CE by a scholar named Nebure Id Yishak of Aksum. E.A. Wallace Budge translated it into English in 1922, and that translation remains the most widely accessible version in the Western world. But the date of compilation, 14th century, is deeply misleading. Nebure Id Yishak did not invent the story he recorded. He codified it. He drew on existing sources in Ge'ez, Coptic, Arabic, and Syriac, sources from multiple traditions, multiple languages, multiple centuries, and he assembled them into a single authoritative text. The tradition behind the Kebra Nagast is far older than 1314. It is older than the Talmud. It is older than the medieval Islamic commentators who placed the queen in Yemen. And what the Kebra Nagast records is this: her name was Makeda, Aim. She was the queen of Aksum, the ancient kingdom centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, in the Tigray highlands south of the Red Sea. The Kebra Nagast describes how Makeda heard of Solomon's wisdom through a merchant named Tamrin, who had been to Jerusalem and returned full of accounts of this king. She traveled to Jerusalem. She arrived with gifts, including, in the Ge'ez description, the same 3 categories the Bible records: spices, gold, and precious stones. She stayed with Solomon for 6 months. She asked him everything she wanted to know. Before she left, Solomon asked her to agree to one condition: that she would take nothing from his household without asking. That night at dinner, she became thirsty. She reached for a cup of water. Solomon had been watching for this. He said, "You have broken our agreement." She said, "The price is only water." He said, "Is there anything in the world more precious than life? And life is sustained by water." The Kebra Nagast records this exchange as both a riddle game and a legal transaction. Her price for breaking the oath was a night in Solomon's bed, and from that union came a son, Menelik I, who would become the first king of the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, who as a young man would travel to Jerusalem to meet his father, be received by Solomon, be given gifts and an escort, and return to Ethiopia, and who would bring back with him, according to the Kebra Nagast, the Ark of the Covenant. This is the foundational narrative of Ethiopian biblical identity, and it is 3,000 years old. Now, I want to be precise about what the Kebra Nagast is and is not. It is not a primary source about the 10th century BCE. It is a codification made in the 14th century CE of traditions that claim roots going back to that period. Our Western scholars' first instinct is to say, too late, too literary, too explicitly political. The Kebra Nagast was compiled during the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia in 1270, and it was designed to legitimate that dynasty. Of course, it traced the Ethiopian royal line back to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. That critique is legitimate, and it applies with exactly equal force to the dominant Western alternative. The identification of the Queen as the ruler of the Sabaean kingdom in Yemen is built on sources no older and arguably less systematically developed than the African tradition. The first claim that she came from southern Arabia rather than Ethiopia comes from Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, 1,000 years after Solomon. The later Islamic tradition that placed her in Yemen and named her Bilqis was invented by the commentator Al-Tabari, who died in 923 CE, 1,200 years after the events he was describing. Both traditions are distant from the original events. Both traditions have political and theological interests. Both traditions are built on the interpretation of a word, Sheba, that the Bible uses without geographic clarification. The Western Academy chose the Yemeni tradition. Ethiopia had been carrying the African tradition continuously, without interruption, since before anyone in Europe had ever written down an opinion about it. 1600 years before any Western scholar decided she was Arabian, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had been practicing a faith rooted in her story, her name, and her legacy. This was never myth. It was identity. Now I need to show you the linguistic evidence, because this is where I think the most important revelation lives, not in the competing historical claims, in the Bible itself. Open the book of Genesis, chapter 10, the Table of Nations. This is the ancient Hebrew genealogical account of all the peoples of the world, organized by their descent from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire biblical corpus, a 10th century BCE attempt to map the known world in terms of ethnic and geographic relationships. Now look at verse 7, Ham's lineage. The sons of Cush, Cush being the ancient Hebrew name for the land we now call Sudan, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa. The sons of Cush are listed as Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. And the sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. There it is, Sheba. In the African lineage, through Ham, through Cush, through Rama. Genesis 10 verse 7. Now look at verse 28, the Semitic lineage. The sons of Shem, through Arphaxad, through Eber, through Joktan. The sons of Joktan are listed, and among them Sheba and Ophir and Havilah. There it is again, Sheba, in the Arabian lineage. Through Shem, through Joktan, the same word, in the same document. In two separate ancestry lists, the African line and the Arabian line. The same author, or the same tradition, that gave us the only account of the Queen's visit in 1 Kings, had already earlier in their own scripture placed the name Sheba on both sides of the Red Sea. This is not a minor textual curiosity. This is the ancient Hebrews themselves acknowledging that Sheba existed on both shores. The 2,000-year debate about whether the Queen of Sheba was African or Arabian may be built on a word the ancient Hebrews themselves used to mean both at once. And it goes deeper, because even within the Jewish tradition, the Queen's existence as a historical person was not universally assumed. Talmud Bava Batra, folio 15b. Some of the Talmudic rabbis argued that the phrase Malkath Sheba, which is translated as the Queen of Sheba, does not necessarily refer to a woman at all. Malkath, they argued, could be read as the kingdom of, not the queen of. The kingdom of Sheba, not a woman, a territory. I am not proposing that reading as correct, but I want you to understand what it tells us. Even in the tradition that compiled 1 Kings, even among the scholars who had been living with this text for centuries, the identity of the queen was contested. The certainty that she was a known Arab ruler from a known Yemeni kingdom, that certainty came later. That certainty came from outside the Jewish tradition, from Josephus, from the Islamic commentators, from the medieval European scholars who found the Yemeni identification convenient. The biblical text is silent. The Jewish interpretive tradition is genuinely uncertain. The African tradition has been specific for 3,000 years. Makeda, Queen of Aksum, mother of Menelik I. Now let me take you to the Quran, because this is one of the most important pieces of evidence in this entire investigation, and it has been misread for over 1,000 years. Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, the chapter of the ant, verses 22 through 44. This is the most extended account of the Queen of Sheba in any scripture, 23 verses, far more detailed than the biblical account. And here is what the Quran says. It says she was a queen. It says she possessed a magnificent throne. It says Solomon sent her a letter summoning her to submit to his authority. It says she was wise enough to seek counsel from her advisors before deciding how to respond. It says she came to Solomon. It says Solomon tested her with her own throne. having it transported to Jerusalem by one of his jinn before she arrived to see if she would recognize it. It describes the scene of her arrival, the glass floor that she mistook for water, the exchange between them, and her eventual acknowledgement of Solomon's God. 23 verses. Geographic location of her kingdom, not mentioned once. The Quran never says Arabia. The Quran never says Yemen. The Quran never says Africa. The name Bilqis, the name universally attached to her in Islamic tradition, appears nowhere in the Quran. Bilqis was invented by Al-Tabari, the historian and Quranic commentator Al-Tabari, who died in 923 CE, wrote a commentary on the Quran and a world history. In that world history, he placed the queen in Yemen and gave her the name Bilqis. He was writing in 9th-century Baghdad. He was drawing on sources he did not fully document, and the name he assigned, Bilqis, was inserted into Islamic tradition with such authority that most Muslims today believe it appears in the Quran itself. It does not. The Quran, like the Bible, is silent on where she came from. The silence in both scriptures is not accidental. It is, I believe, a reflection of the same reality that Genesis chapter 10 encodes. She was not from one place that could be named with certainty. Sheba was on both sides of the water. There is a geographical reality that none of the scholarly debates have adequately addressed. The Red Sea in the 10th century BCE was not a barrier. It was a highway. Stuart Munro Hay, who spent decades studying the archaeology of the Aksumite civilization, documented this with extraordinary precision. The ancient Sabaean civilization, which is the civilization used to justify the Yemeni identification of the queen, was not confined to the Arabian Peninsula. The Sabaeans had established colonies on the African shore of the Red Sea. They were a maritime commercial civilization that operated on both sides of the water simultaneously. The question is not African shore or Arabian shore. The question is which shore of a civilization that occupied both. And here is the chronology problem that the Western Academy has largely avoided addressing. The Sabaean kingdom of Yemen peaked in the 8th century BCE. Solomon's reign was the 10th century BCE, 200 years earlier. The strongest period of the Yemeni Sabaean civilization falls 2 centuries after Solomon. The African pre-Aksumite civilization was already well established in the 10th century BCE. Egyptian records document the land of Punt, which scholars widely associate with the Horn of Africa, as a trading partner from 1500 BCE onward. The trade goods documented in those records are the same trade goods the Queen brought to Solomon: spices, gold, precious stones. Scholar Wendy Laura Belcher of Princeton has argued precisely this. The pre-Aksumite African connection to the Red Sea trade routes is better dated to the 10th century BCE than the Yemeni case. Both traditions have something to explain, but the African tradition has the geography, the chronology, and 3,000 years of continuous cultural memory. The Western tradition has an assumption built on a word the ancient Hebrews themselves placed on both sides of the sea. Now let me take you to the most extraordinary piece of evidence in this entire investigation, something that most people in the English-speaking world have never been told. Ethiopia's Constitution of 1955. Article 2. I want to read it to you exactly as it was written. This is not poetry. This is not mythology. This is the enforceable constitutional law of a sovereign nation. The imperial dignity shall remain perpetually attached to the line of Haile Selassie I, descendant of King Saleh Selassie, whose line descends without interruption from the dynasty of Menelik I, son of Queen of Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of Jerusalem. End of Article 2. Let me tell you when this was written. 1955. The year Elvis Presley released his first single. The year the Warsaw Pact was formed. 3 years after the Korean War ended. 19 years after the Berlin Olympics. Not 3,000 years ago. Not in a medieval manuscript. In 1955, the sovereign nation of Ethiopia, a modern state recognized by the United Nations, declared in its constitution that its head of state was a direct biological descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, Makeda of Ethiopia, in an unbroken line of 3,000 years. This remained constitutional law until 1974. The year Nixon resigned? For the duration of Haile Selassie's reign, the claim that the Ethiopian royal house descended from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba was not a cultural tradition, it was the law. And this claim did not begin with the 1955 constitution. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, the ruling dynasty that traced itself back to Menelik I, was established in 1270 CE, when Yakuno Amlak restored it after a period of interruption. That is 750 years before the 1955 constitution. But even that date understates the age of the tradition. The Aksumite inscriptions of Ezana, the 4th-century CE king of Aksum, already show a kingdom identifying itself with biblical Israel, not as metaphor, as identity. Ezana converted the Aksumite kingdom to Christianity around 330 CE. His inscriptions, written in Ge'ez Greek and South Arabian script, 3 languages on stone in the 4th century, describe a kingdom that already understood itself as having a direct relationship with the God of Israel, 1,000 years before the Kebra Nagast was compiled. The tradition of the African identity of the Queen of Sheba does not begin in the 14th century. It begins in the 4th century, in stone inscriptions, and likely much earlier in oral transmission. It has been continuous ever since. Now let me bring these threads together, because I think what I have shown you tonight reveals something important. Not just about one historical figure, but about how historical narratives are constructed, and who gets to construct them. The question of where the Queen of Sheba came from has never been settled by evidence. It has been settled by authority. The Western scholarly consensus chose the Arabian identification not because the evidence demanded it, but because the evidence was ambiguous, and someone with authority made a choice. Josephus chose Arabia. Al-Tabari chose Yemen and invented the name Bilqis. The European scholars who built the academic tradition of biblical studies in the 18th and 19th centuries inherited those choices without seriously interrogating them, and the African tradition, 1600 years old, continuously maintained, embedded in constitutional law, was treated as a regional myth rather than a textual tradition deserving equal scholarly scrutiny. What is different tonight is that the textual analysis changes this. Genesis chapter 10 cannot be revised away. Sheba appears in both lineages, in the Bible itself, in the document that introduces the queen to world literature in the first place. The ancient Hebrews who wrote that text knew that Sheba existed on both sides of the Red Sea. They wrote it down. And for 2,000 years, most of the people reading the Bible looked past that passage to build an argument that Genesis itself refuses to support. Now I need to tell you something about what happened when I came back to this material 20 years after standing in my grandmother's parlor. I had been a scholar for 3 decades. I had accepted the Arabian consensus because that is what the weight of academic authority seemed to demand. Then I read the Kebra Nagast in full. Then I found Genesis chapter 10 verse 7. Then I read Ethiopia's 1955 constitution. And I did something I had not done in 20 years. I called my grandmother. She was still in Nsukka, still in her 80s, still sharp. I told her what I had found. I told her about Genesis 10 verse 7, the African genealogy. I told her about the Kebra Nagast and the constitutional law. I told her about Makeda and Menelik and the Aksumite inscriptions. She listened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with exactly the patience I remembered from when I was 9 years old, I told you, we remember. She was not surprised. She had not spent 30 years as a scholar. She had not read the Kebra Nagast. She had not cross-referenced Genesis genealogies. She had looked at a portrait on a wall in Nsukka, and she had known with the kind of knowing that does not require a bibliography that the dark-skinned woman in those elaborate robes was not a stranger to Africa. She was ours. That is what she had said when I was 9. And she was right, not because she had evidence I did not have, because she had memory I had been taught to distrust. I want to close with what the title promises. The truth only Africa knows. I have shown you tonight that Africa's knowledge of the Queen of Sheba is not a tradition built on wish fulfillment or political identity. It is built on a name, Makeda, that predates any Western scholarly claim about the Queen by centuries. It is built on a dynasty, the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, that ruled for 700 years before the 1955 constitution codified its claim into law. It is built on a church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that has maintained this tradition without interruption for 1600 years, rooted in an identity that was inscribed in stone by Aksumite kings before the medieval Islamic commentators had invented the Arabian alternative. And it is confirmed, quietly without ceremony in the Table of Nations in the Book of Genesis, by the very tradition that introduced the queen to world literature. Sheba was in both lines. The African line is in the text. It has always been in the text. Africa was not defending a tradition against the evidence. Africa was holding the evidence that the Academy spent centuries failing to read carefully enough. My grandmother knew this. She did not know it because she had read the Kebra Nagast. She knew it because she was inside the living current of a memory that has never broken. She held that memory in a parlor in Nsukka, in a framed print on a wall, in a portrait of a dark-skinned queen in elaborate robes, the Queen of Sheba. She was ours. I told her what I found. She was not surprised, because the memory does not require confirmation. But confirmation, when it arrives 3,000 years later in the form of a constitutional article and a double genealogy in Genesis, is not without meaning. It means that what was always known was always true, and what was always true did not require the approval of the Academy to remain true. What you do with this is yours. But if someone tells you that Africa has nothing to do with Solomon, if someone tells you that the queen of that famous encounter was Arabian and the African tradition is myth, you now have exactly what you need to respond. Genesis 10, verse 7, Makeda, Menelik I, 1955. She told you, "We remember